Well, good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and you are listening to Life Along the Merrimack. This is a weekly podcast that is heard on 96.3 FM and on cablecast on Comcast. The program can be reviewed on YouTube as many times as you want. Happy New Year, Part 2. One of the elements, last week we talked about the birth of the Coast Guard. Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard, and we went from a history. We had 1790 till about 1900, talking about what happened in each given year. I'm going to be doing some of the same of that today, except first I must express my ebullience. And my ebullience comes from the fact that I finally finished my book about the Coast Guard. It's called New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Mariners. The History Press in South Carolina is publishing it. And when you say you finished a book, there are numerous iterations to the word finishing the book. I finished the book. I finished writing it last December. And this is like 13 months ago. There was a long delay, and it wasn't copy edited until, say, November of this year. So I copy edited the book. The people at the History Press copy edited it, and that's I thought things were finished. But no, they made corrections. The copy editor there in South Carolina made corrections, sent them to me. And by corrections, it could be a photo in the wrong place. It could be a typo. It could have been an incorrect fact. It could be someone you forgot on the acknowledgments, which I almost did. But so then it was reread again. And here in Newburyport, a wonderful proofreader named Beth Welch, who worked for St. Martin's Press for many years, lives in Newbury. She was kind enough to proofread the proofread edition. So this is really going into minutia, but it's also another pair of eyes looking at it. And that proved to be very helpful. She saved me from myself, I will say that. She caught many errors, typos. Again, we're not restructuring the book. We're not adding new photos at this point. We're just being fastidious about each and every line. And as I thought about it, maybe this is why books take so long to get out. Maybe that's why they are expensive, because you have to have numerous people working on them, line by line, semicolon by semicolon. There's no easy way to do it, because we just don't accept errors in books. Like on television, errors frequently happen and they go away. Even in a newspaper, if there's an error, most people ignore it. But the editor can go back if there's enough pressure put on him and correct that. So, but that's not the way with books. We're not happy when there's an error in a book or a typo in a book. Think about it yourself. If you saw a typo on page 10 and a incorrect spelling on page 25, you'd say, gee, this book, I'm losing my concentration because this isn't correct. Anyway, so Beth Welch proofread it. We sent those corrections back. And earlier this week, I got a copy of, from an editor. Another editor down at History Press said, I've put in all the corrections that you wanted. Take a look at this. It should be everything. If you see anything, tell me. But basically, you're finished. So I did see a couple things, and one is I changed the names, not changed the names, I corrected the names and the acknowledgments. I have many people in the acknowledgments, and some of them helped me with the research on the Coast Guard. Others helped me with a program called Kickstarter. Now, that is a program online where you make it known that you're trying to raise money to do the arts. And I made a request in 2008 and said, geez, I'm trying to write a book about the Coast Guard. Can you give me some financial support so I can travel around New England, so I can take photos, so I can buy photos, things like that. Anyway, 50 people contributed. I aggregated almost $5,000, which is wonderful. Thank you very much, contributors. So I was off to the races. Anyway, the whole process seems to be done now. I can't go back anymore. I keep thinking, on my way over here, did I, get that admiral into the book, or, did I remember this person in the acknowledgments? But it's too late. And so my book is finished, and I'm thrilled. And just on that note, I'm about to sign a contract to write another book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. It'll be a history of the Merrimack River, starting from way up in New Hampshire and coming to its conclusion in Newburyport. The river is 117 miles long. The history is very colorful and broad. The Native Americans were there first, of course. The settlers came in the 17th century. In the late 18th century, mills started appearing on the river, and by 1820 or so, in the 19th century, Lowell was created with very large textile mills. Lawrence was built for the specific purpose of building mills and housing workers. So that's one element that is certainly important in the history of the Merrimack River, is that the mills were here. They employed thousands. We can hardly even think about it today. It also did an enormous job of polluting the river. There was no such thing as being careful about putting garbage into the river or putting dyes into the river. In fact, some industrialists at that time, and I'm thinking 1837, that's the quote that's in my mind, one mill owner said, well, that's the price we pay. We employ a lot of people. We sell a lot of goods. If the river is slightly ruined, so be it. So you can see that there's a big change of heart. And also on the Merrimack River, there was the start of the American labor movement because, eventually the mills were not paying much money. They were taking advantage of people, and especially children. The American labor movement had its earliest start in 1914 in Lawrence with what was called the Red Rose strike, and people were just asking for somewhat of a better deal. There was, there were hundreds of state militia people brought in. It was a peaceful event, but by the end, say 1829, 1830, it was more restive, and there was conflict, and there were fights, and there were physical affray. So the Industrial Revolution, as it related to hydropower, started on the Merrimack River. The Coast Guard, of course, as we recall, started on the Merrimack River. Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. We talked about that last week. The first revenue cutter that Alexander Hamilton and George Washington ordered to collect money and to stop smuggling, that was built in Newburyport. That was the Massachusetts. So that is why Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. So we have that. And in my view, we also have 1972, when Senator Ed Muskie of Maine, Ted Kennedy, Senator Kennedy was in on it as well, managed to pass the Clean Water Act. Now, obviously, this wasn't just for our area. Maine, in fact, had 3 of the dirtiest rivers in the country, but Newburyport's Merrimack River was on the list of among the dirtiest rivers in the country. So from 1972 on, the Federal Clean Water Act had enormous influence on cleaning rivers like the Merrimack. It also cleaned the main rivers that had many sawmills and pulp mills on the river, and they would just put the refuse right in the river. So that was a terrific event also, starting in New England. So the river is getting dirtier, not cleaner. That we've talked about. But I'm not going to dwell on that today, actually. I'm just wanted to share with you my glee, not Glee Woodworth, glee as it relates to Dyke Hendrickson, my glee in finishing the final corrections. It's out there. They said it was going to be published in March. they've said a lot of things. For 11 months, nothing happened at all. But now it's on the press as we speak. I don't know if they'll run the press, but I'm hoping it comes out in early March. And if so, I will make a great announcement, because I'll be signing books, and I'll be smiling broadly, and I will be paying back, or with great gratitude, those who were involved in my Kickstarter campaign. Now, I'm thinking about a Kickstarter campaign for the next book, which is about Merrimack, the resilient river. But it would be poor form for me to start a second Kickstarter campaign when the book that just was funded by Kickstarter has not come out yet. So after that comes out, I give copies to those who contributed. We will think about a Kickstarter campaign. Anyway, consider me happy, consider me walking on clouds, because the Coast Guard book is finished. Although I must say, I remember the Commandant of the New England Coast Guard, Admiral Sangas, when I saw him in the fall, I spoke at the Merrimack, at the museum, the Custom House Maritime Museum on Water Street, where I am the outreach historian. Afterwards, and this was before, not after, so to me it indicates he saw the whole thing and liked it. He said, when this comes out, call me. I'll do what you can, or what I can, to move this along and, see if we can make it known. So I'm going to send him a copy as soon as it comes out. And then I'm going to ask if he'd like to send me on a tour of New England Coast Guard stations so I can speak about the history of the Coast Guard. And my reasoning for this is that most people, and that includes coasties, do not know the history of the Coast Guard. They do not know about Hamilton and Washington and Newburyport. They do not know about the early days of the Coast Guard. So I think it would be useful because in so many ways, the Coast Guard has a great background. It has many wonderful stories. It has defended this country in every war we have had. It has lost lives over the years. And on any seashore along the Atlantic, and also on many rivers, including the Mississippi River, where I visited recently. I was in Memphis, and of course Memphis is on the Mississippi River. They have 2 Coast Guard stations. But I think I'll just ring him up, as they say, and said, Admiral, I'm finished. Here's a book, and here's also a proposal to send me to a number of Coast Guard stations in New England. So I'm sharing my plans with you in part because in many cases my plans never work out, so it's not like I'm divulging serious facts or discoveries. Many times they don't work. But anyway, last week we started and we had the first lecture, if you will, in the history of the Coast Guard. And I think this is important because these are archived, and I think it's important that we have it. This is verbal. There'll be a book. But it's interesting for me to go over the history of the Coast Guard, since in Newburyport and all along the Merrimack, we have such a significant tie. So our last date that we mentioned, this was last week, was 1890. And we talked about the Coast Guard cutter Walcott confiscating undeclared opium on board a steamer. Now, that is important because that was the first time that the Coast Guard had interceded to stop drugs. And now, as we know today, 2020, much of the Coast Guard's work is trying to stop the flow of drugs. But 1890 was the first time. I find that interesting. Okay, 1910, the Revenue Cutter School of Instruction moved from Curtis Bay, Maryland, to Fort Trumbull in London, Connecticut. That is important because the Coast Guard Academy is in New London, Connecticut, for that very reason. And that was a year that it moved for the first time. And I've been down to the Coast Guard Academy many times. They have a museum at the Coast Guard Academy, which is free. and you can go in there. It is not what we call a world-class museum. And for that reason, the Coast Guard and a number of alums are trying to create a really substantial, incredible museum, also in New London. The bill for this museum that they're planning is $100 million. They have not started it yet. They've got contributions from city, state, and federal. They have some contributions from the private sector. But raising $1 million is not a simple thing. And also, in New London, Connecticut, where they're planning it, that has been a little controversial as well. They would take, a significant part of the waterfront in New London and turn it into a museum. And so, we think about ourselves in Newburyport. Well, if someone wanted to build a 100,000 square foot museum in Newburyport and thus take up, most of Cashman Park, or thus take up most of the open area behind the firehouse, we might be a little concerned about that. So that is what's happening in New London. It's hard to raise $100 million, and some of the town folk aren't that enthusiastic. Our next date is 1910 as well. President Taft urged the Coast Guard to save money by merging with the Revenue Cutter Service and the Life Saving Service. I should clarify that. There wasn't really an official Coast Guard in 1910, but when these two elements did merge in 1915, that is when we started using the term U.S. Coast Guard. We'll get to 1915 shortly. But first, 1912, the Titanic collides with an iceberg off Newfoundland while sailing from England to New York. It sank in 2 hours, and I think many of us know the story. 1,500 people were lost out of 2,200, so almost 70% of the people were lost. The tragedy led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, and the Coast Guard was brought in to be part of a team to manage the ice control and what was happening offshore. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson signed a bill merging the Life Saving Service and the Revenue Cutter Service to establish the Coast Guard. So, class, that's our date for today, 1915. That's important because, as we've discussed, there are numerous names for what became the Coast Guard, but in 1915 it was named the Coast Guard, and we must remember that. In 1939, the Coast Guard added the the lighthouse service, and so they finally had those three organizations in one. In 1920, that's our next date, the Volstead Act, better known as Prohibition, went into effect. This was later called a rum war, and it became the largest task the Coast Guard ever had. It lasted for 13 years until 1933, and there are many stories about how difficult this was for the Coast Guard. Most people consider it a mistake now. The Coast Guard, and the many stories right here in Newburyport about smuggling off of Plum Island, boats coming in and out, fishermen helping smugglers. I mean, it was an enormous event. And it's one that even historians today remember as a great challenge for the Coast Guard. And I, would mention, I'd just stop here to say that, this is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. And we talk about the Coast Guard frequently, and that's what we're doing today. This is 96.3 and on Cablecast as well, Comcast. And so this is what we're doing today, part 2 of the history of the Coast Guard. In 1924, the Coast Guard started expanding so that it could start enforcing Prohibition. 31 destroyers, 200 cabin cruisers, and 100 smaller boats were acquired by the Coast Guard for the rum war. So this is showing that it's a big deal, because there was a lot of criticism. It was, probably our version of Al Capone in Chicago. It was really known. There was a lot of violence on the New England coast. Fishing boats were sunk. Shootouts took place. In fact, in my book on the Coast Guard that's coming out, there's a long story about 1929. There was a shootout at Plum Island between rum runners and the Coast Guard, and actually a coastie was killed by another coastie. Yep, it was friendly fire. So that actually is in the annals of the Coast Guard, but it shows you how dangerous it was. And so right here at Plum Island, we had our own problems. 1933, the 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. And so the Coast Guard refocused on other missions. It also moved from Fort Trumbull, which you just mentioned, to its present campus in New London, Connecticut. That's the Coast Guard Academy. The Coast Guard Academy moved from Trumbull, Connecticut to New London. In 1939, as we just said, the lighthouse service was consolidated with the Coast Guard. This was made in the interest of efficiency and economy, and it integrated about 30,000 aids to navigation, including light vessels and lighthouses. It had 5,200 employees, 64 buoy tenders, 30 depots, and 17 district offices. So 1939, things were consolidated. 1939 is also the year that Igor Sikorsky constructed the first functioning helicopter. This was in Connecticut, and I've got to say, I would have thought that helicopters had been created before that. I mean, there aren't too many films of World War I, for obvious reasons, but you know, I thought I'd seen helicopters before World War II, but that is not the case. 1939, he moved forward. In the early 40s, the Coast Guard started using them, and they've really become valuable. I think we all know that now. That in the Bounty, for instance, the tall ship that went down in 2012, Coast Guard folks went out in choppers, you know, every couple hours. This was in North Carolina, but nevertheless, 16 people were in the water. They saved 14 of 16 because they had choppers. They never would have been able probably to save anybody had they not had choppers. So the Coast Guard really benefited from helicopters. Now we come into a little more science. In 1940, the Ocean Station program established a situation where the Coast Guard would get involved in the weather and monitoring weather and sending out weather reports. Now, if you're in a vessel now, you know how valuable it is to get Coast Guard reports. This program in 1940 was known as the Atlantic Weather Observation Service, later known as the Ocean Station Weather Program. So over the years, as we can see, the Coast Guard is growing in responsibility, in funding, and, just continued to expand. In 1941, the Coast Guard was ordered to operate as part of the Navy when the war came. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, of course, and the Coast Guard was brought in. In 1942, sad to say, the Coast Guard vessel Alexander Hamilton was struck by a torpedo off of Iceland, and 26 members were lost. Now, that's very sad. Alexander Hamilton is one of the great friends of the Coast Guard in history. He was, of course, known as the founder of the Coast Guard, but a vessel holding his name went down in 1942. Because America needed troops and no one knew how long this conflict would last, Congress established a women's Coast Guard reserve known as the SPARS. That's an acronym for Semper Paratus, always ready. Now, that's what the men's division had always been known for. That was their motto. So the SPARS just took up on it. And so they had an enormous amount of women step forward to join. Several thousand joined the SPARS. They worked in offices. They did a great deal of communications work. They were very helpful. Curiously, though, they had several thousand in the spars, but by 1946 they were all I wouldn't say unemployed, but they were dismissed. So even though they had done great work, all the spars were gone, and by 1950 there were only about several hundred in the Coast Guard. In 1952, the Coast Guard helped with a collision off of Cape Cod. The SS Fort Mercer and the SS Pendleton both broke up during a nor'easter off of Cape Cod in 52. That rescue was hailed in the movie The Finest Hours, and you might remember it showed the dedication of the Coast Guard and how difficult it can be to try to do life-saving in those conditions. In 1956 was the passage of the Small Passenger Vessel Act. In the 50s, consumers were buying boats and recreation was expanding. World War II was over, the economy was very good, and now the Coast Guard was put in charge of many of the elements, here at Plum Island or, on the river or in lakes throughout New England, the large ones like Lake Champlain. So this was a situation where the Coast Guard got even more responsibility. Now, the Coast Guard got involved in foreign relations in 1961. The Coast Guard establishes Cuban patrols to aid refugees and to enforce neutrality, interdicting the transportation of men and arms. Now, you folks might remember when Cubans started fleeing the island, this was after the Bay of Pigs, the Coast Guard was around to pick up many of them. In 1961, here's for you design people, the Coast Guard assumed its racing stripe, the narrow blue bar inside orange-red bar that goes on all Coast Guard vessels. So this is a minor fact, but here we are. 1961, it got the orange stripe. In 1971, President Richard Nixon signed the first Federal Boat Safety Act, and that was very significant because we just said that there was more recreational boating in those days, and this made the Coast Guard responsible to a great degree for recreational boating. And then, of course, as we just said, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972, the Clean Water Act, came forth through Muskie and Kennedy and others, and that meant the start of people on the Coast Guard especially being more environmentally conscious. The Coast Guard became, they go to see oil spills, and they became a real force in trying to clean up rivers in the ocean. In 1976, the Fishery Conservation and Management Act created a 200-mile zone. You folks might remember that, some might. It was supposed to help the fishermen, but it also gave the Coast Guard more responsibility. So we're winding up for today. I hate to say it, this went fast. If I hadn't talked about my ebullience and talked about history, we would have been better off. I'll end, though, with 1976. The first female cadets enter the Coast Guard Academy in New London. And this is a big deal. Women were assuming larger responsibility, larger roles. And so in 76, the Coast Guard began taking women in the Coast Guard Academy, and they started accepting more women, many more women, for enlisted ranks. So that was, the Coast Guard turned a big corner then, having women in from 1976 on, and just, changing the way they looked at things. And in my book, I interviewed about 22 people, and 12 of them are women, because in the book, I wanted to have them talk about what their lives were like in the Coast Guard. So that's about going to do it for us. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I am Dyke Hendrickson. I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum. I wish I could stay longer, as they say, but there's always next week. And thank you for listening and watching. Thank you for being a part of this as we all try to learn more about the Merrimack River, its history, and its health. Thank you very much.